Good afternoon, everybody. We'll give everybody just a couple minutes to get in here and get situated as we get started. I'm Dr. Becky Bowling. I am an assistant professor and extension specialist for urban water up here at the Dallas Center. You are joining us for another episode of Chat with Green Aggies. We'll do a brief round of introductions. Paul.
Hi, I am Paul Winsky. I am the commercial horticulture agent in Harris County, which encompasses Houston.
Laura.
And I'm Laura Miller, commercial horticulture agent in Tarrant County, aka Fort Worth, Grapevine, Arlington.
We're operating with kind of a skeleton crew today. We've got a few people that have other speaking engagements. We also have a couple people that are not feeling well. So it's going to be a fairly small group today, but we're hoping to still have a lot of good, fun discussion. And we're going to start off this week a little different order. We're going to start off with our plant of the week. So Paul's going to share some fun information on ornamental peppers, which I just love. So we'll start off with that.
All right. Well, thank you, Becky. We're still talking about Texas Superstars. So today you get 3 for 1. There are 3 ornamental peppers that are part of the Texas Superstar program. So on my left here, we have Basket of Fire. In the middle, we have NuMex Twilight. And on the right, we've got Purple Flash. And so you can see Basket of Fire and NuMex Twilight are, pretty similar in their presentation. So Basket of Fire has these real nice tight habit flowers and fruits over the entire plant. New fruits start out in a creamy yellow and then they go to orange and red. So you get that flame look to it as they mature. The NuMex Twilight, I love these because I like the way that fruit is held above the foliage. So it doesn't get lost inside there. And they remind me of the like the C9 bulbs, the Christmas lights. The cool thing about these is when they first color up, they're purple, and then they change to orange and red and different colors like that. This time of year, especially in Houston and South Texas, the ornamental peppers are pretty popular, whether you're using them alone as a standalone or as a bedding plant or in your combination planter. So this is the time of year that you can really enjoy them, and the colors are definitely fall type colors. The third one is Purple Flash, and this one we're not growing it for that ornamental pepper. It's really was chosen for its foliage. So you can see that dark purple foliage, and then the new growth has that sort of creamy white, and it transitions as it matures. It does set a very tiny pepper, probably a little bit larger than a BB. It will turn red, but it is down inside that plant. So this is one that, we're not growing for the fruit. We're growing it for the foliage to add some color and contrast into the landscape. The other great thing about these is we normally get the questions, are they edible? Both Basket of Fire and NuMex Twilight are. Basket of Fire comes in at about 80,000 Scoville heat units. And just as a reference, a jalapeno is in the range of 2,500 to 8,000. And a cayenne pepper is in the range of 30 to 50,000. So it's going to be hotter than a cayenne. So, maybe that Basket of Fire, it's not just a presentation of those, of the color of the fruits, but also the flavor and the taste of it. The NuMex Twilight is similar in flavor or heat to the cayenne. It's in that 30 to 50,000 range. On the production side, whether you do them in packs or quarts or 6-inch or maybe a gallon tops for all 3 of these. And then the other thing that's really interesting is a lot of these ornamental peppers, there's been a lot of research they are great sources of banker plants for beneficial insects. So if you've got them in your garden and they are in flower, you've got an alternate food source if your pest population is low. So you can bring those beneficials in and maintain them in the garden until you need them. So there's an added benefit to incorporating these ornamental peppers into your landscape. So With that, Becky, I can turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I love ornamental peppers, but they are not the most palatable for sure.
This is true.
So I did notice that we have somebody joining us today that can join in our discussion. So I'm going to unmute him here and give him a chance to introduce himself. Skip, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi. I was just sitting in kind of stalking these other horticulturists today, so thank you. I'm Skip, I'm horticulturist in Brazos County.
Awesome. Yeah, you have to change your name if you don't want to be put to work, you know, that's how it works.
Have to sign in as peanut butter or something, you know.
So today you might have seen on our agenda that we're going to talk a little bit about preventing spring diseases with practices in the fall. Originally, Kevin Ong was supposed to present on this topic. Unfortunately, he had a scheduling conflict. And so rather than focusing more on ornamentals and landscape plants, we're going to focus more on turf grass because that's something I'm a little bit more familiar with. But of course, we have two experienced horticulturists with us today, so we can have some additional discussion that may include some of those ornamentals as well. So I'm going to share here. Okay. So this is a topic that Mung suggested, and I think it's a good topic because fall is a really good time to implement strong cultural practices that significantly help protect plants in the landscape, turf, especially in the spring from certain diseases that we commonly see. So I like to start just a little bit with the disease triangle, right? Always got to start with a good disease triangle picture. So anytime we have disease present in the landscape, we have to have three main things for that to be there. The first is the susceptible host, which would be our plant. In this case, we're talking about turf grass, but it could also be trees, other things in the landscape. Then we also have to have a pathogen present. And then most importantly, we have to have a favorable environment to promote this disease. And so that's where cultural control practices really come into play because we can have some significant influence over that environment with how we choose to manage our landscape area. So I wanted to start off just with a couple of very basic tips from a cultural standpoint, and then we'll go into a little bit more detailed discussion, and we'll talk about some of our more common diseases that we'll see, particularly in turf grass lawns. If you're joining us from a golf course or a much higher input turf grass system, you get to see more diseases than probably the average turf grass manager, just as a function of those especially high inputs and some of those more unique cultivars. But we're going to focus a little bit more just based on our audience on some of these more landscape diseases today. So I'm going to try to make sure I got the chat window open here. All right. Okay. So one of the first things that I wanted to make sure that everybody understands, because I've had people be genuinely confused about this idea of scalping turf intentionally. And I actually have had people scalp their turf grass areas in the fall, thinking that they're doing a beneficial practice. And what they end up doing instead is putting their turf grass system into shock right at a critical point in the season when the turf is trying to prepare for this significant drop in temperature. So we do sometimes see with certain turf grass species the practice of scalping in the spring. Primarily, we see this practice with Bermuda and zoysia grass because both of those species produce below ground rhizomes, which means they're better able to tolerate that mechanical practice. St. Augustine, by comparison, does not produce rhizomes. It only produces stolons, which means when we do a scalping practice, we run the risk of significantly injuring that species in a way that can be very detrimental. Now, the reasoning that we see for people sometimes, turf professionals, sometimes scalping in the spring, it's kind of twofold. So the first is as a practice for removing thatch and debris that accumulated from the previous year. So we do know that some of these diseases can persist in excessive thatch buildup, and that can be an issue. There's a number of different ways to manage thatch, including verticutting or dethatching through through vertical mowing. Core aeration, or the aeration where we remove physical plugs, is another way that we can reduce thatch. And then also top dressing to add the soil material, some kind of soil material to our thatch layer to encourage microbial breakdown of that material. This scalping practice is another one of those methods that we may sometimes see used to remove debris. The other thing that we may see kind of a benefit from scalping in the spring is that we expose some of the soil to sunlight and we increase the warmth of the soil, which can help accelerate spring green up. And so in professional turf management systems, that's a desirable trait, that we have greener turf a little earlier in the season. Now, if we look at the literature on spring scalping, there's a lot of conflicting information out there in terms of appropriate timing. Some sources recommend that you scalp just prior to spring green up, kind of once you're past that risk of late season frost. Other sources recommend that you do this after turf grass is actively growing for the year. In general, you know, if you're talking about just a regular home lawn, I don't know that this is a practice that I would recommend. If you're joining us as a professional and this is something that you want to experiment with your Bermuda and zoysia grass areas, I recommend, you know, doing a little fine tuning in your own practices to see what works best for you. And again, just being cautious about the fact that if we do this too early in the season, we expose these areas to significant risk of frost winter kill. And we also expose them to potential weed encroachment as well. So when we scalp too late in the season, we can actually increase the likelihood of certain diseases. We see a correlation between scalping and large patch disease, which we'll talk about a lot today. That's going to be a pretty big player when we're talking about turf diseases that kind of show up in the fall and persist and really become bothersome in the spring months. And so we certainly want to avoid any late season scalping. If we get out there and we try to do one last mowing for the year, keeping that mowing height just a little bit taller. This helps to preserve the root system that the turf grass has developed over the course of the season. As we're going into the winter, we really want it to have the strongest, deepest, most robust root system possible, just to help it survive those stresses as we transition into a new season. And when we scalp, we sometimes encourage that the plant pools reserves from that root system, and that just puts it at a disadvantage. So avoiding any late season scalping or physical injury to the turf is going to be really important. You know, along this same vein, trying to stay on the upper end of our recommended mowing height range for whatever species we're managing going into the winter months. Again, you can drop this down once we start growing again the following spring. But going into the fall, winter, we want to try to maintain a little bit taller mowing height, again, to encourage that deeper root growth. I wanted to talk a little bit about irrigation practices. I actually got an email this morning asking me about appropriate winter irrigation practices for turf grass. So I wanted to discuss that just a little bit here. Generally, here in the state of Texas, we do not need to have our irrigation on, certainly not automated between fall and spring. So there's a pretty significant period of time where our irrigation system should largely be turned off, and we should only turn it on manually as needed during those transition seasons to help water in products, or if we happen to go through an unusually dry period during the fall or the spring. A lot of times in winter, there's a few different reasons why we really don't need to have our irrigation system on at all. The first is that most of our warm season turf grasses are just not actively growing during this period. They tend to concentrate their growth when we have warmer temperatures. Grasses like Bermuda, zoysia, St. Augustine grass tend to have the majority of their shoot growth occur during temperatures between around 80 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So as our temperatures drop, they're just not growing as much, and the demand for water goes down significantly. Even if we're in a part of the state where we don't go dormant, you know, as we go further south, we don't necessarily see turf grass go dormant, but we will typically see a significant slowdown in growth and demand of water. The other reason is that a lot of times during these winter months, we typically see an increase in natural precipitation throughout the state. And so while there are some studies out there that show that especially dry conditions over winter can be harmful to turf grass, it can be damaging to their rhizomes and roots. Most of the time here in Texas, we get sufficient rainfall during those months to kind of offset that concern. And so what this ends up meaning is that as soon as we hit right around October, September, sometimes in more northern parts of the state, automated irrigation should be off. You should just turn it off. You can turn your irrigation system on manually as needed if you feel there's a need. And for the most part, we don't need to turn irrigation on again until the following April, May. And in some cases, it may be even later, depending on what's happening that year in the state and what's happening in your particular region. So this is just to kind of show you where our primary supplemental irrigation needs are. They tend to be concentrated again, typically between around May and September or October, depending on what's happening seasonally. Outside of these months, we typically don't need to have any automated irrigation on, and overwatering can increase the likelihood of turf grass disease. I also wanted to share, this is some data for North Texas in particular, so Dallas-Fort Worth area, and this is from the Texas ET Network. So there's similar data like this for many other parts of the state. I'm just happening to show, the data for where I live. And what this shows you is average precipitation on a monthly basis. And these are 50-year averages. And then average watering requirement based on what we know about the average weather data and the need of turfgrass areas. And what you can see here is that typically our rainfall is sufficient to meet our watering requirement that our turf has for the majority of the year. And the only real exception that we see again here in North Texas is typically between June and September. That's not to say that we may not have an especially dry May where we need to turn the water on earlier, or we may have an especially dry and warm October where we need to keep it on a little longer. But most of the time, again, our watering efforts are concentrated right during these summer months, and the rest of the time automated irrigation should be turned off. Okay. Now this time of year, it's also important that, as we move into the fall, and we're really kind of past this window that we really need to be watering at all, but just for future reference, as we kind of wind down, it becomes especially important that we concentrate our irrigation practices in the early morning hours. When we water during midday, anytime, it increases evaporative losses. So that's just a poor practice. And as we move into transition seasons in particular, watering in the evening can prolong the period of leaf wetness on the turf. This can lead to increased disease activity. So typically I recommend that people concentrate their watering efforts between around 3 a.m. and 9 a.m. The other thing that we want to be aware of is that shaded areas in our landscape are typically going to be the most susceptible to disease activity. And so these areas in particular, we're going to want to keep an eye on. We're going to want to make sure that we do not scalp these areas. A lot of times during the primary growing season, we might recommend that these shaded areas are actually kept at a slightly higher mowing height. We also, in general, recommend that your fertilizer and water inputs in these shaded areas are generally should be lower than what you have in your full sun areas, because the demand is just really different for those more heavily shaded areas. We also may see increased weed encroachment, other things happening in these more heavily shaded areas. If you get to a point that you're getting about less than around 5 hours of light a day in these areas, typically we might recommend that you consider an alternative to turf, just so that you're not fighting an uphill battle forever. So again, we're talking a lot today primarily about warm season turf grass. These are physiologically different turf grass species from cool season turf grasses. And if you get online and you look at recommendations for fall turf preparation, winter turf management, you may see a lot of conflicting data as a function of there being very different outputs from parts of the country that primarily manage cool season turf as opposed to warm season turf. Cool season turf is going to include things like ryegrass, bluegrass, fescue, and we do have some parts of the state where we see more of those species, particularly up in the panhandle. These species are not as water efficient, they're not as nitrogen efficient. They can be more shade tolerant, and they primarily are going to concentrate their growth in the spring and fall months, where we will see them more active in the wintertime. Conversely, our warm season grasses, which include Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, St. Augustine grass, centipede grass, buffalo grass, these grasses are going to primarily grow during warmer months again. So a lot of our inputs should be concentrated during that period, because that's when those species are actively growing. Putting in a lot of water or fertilizer inputs during these off seasons, typically it's just not beneficial and can be do more harm than good. So when we're thinking about turfgrass diseases, this is an overview of some of the more common turfgrass diseases that we see here in the state of Texas. I'm seeing a couple of quick questions I'm gonna answer real quick. So Nick is asking, what type of alternatives would you recommend for low light areas? It kind of depends on where you are in the state and kind of what your management goals are, but we do have a few native ground covers here in Texas that do very well in the shade. A lot of times people may think of them more as weeds, but they do really well in the shade. Horse herb is one of those. Frog fruit is another that does fairly well in the shade. We also have some good, yes, thank you, Laura. We also have some good ornamentals that do quite well in densely shaded areas. One that I really like is inland sea oats. It's a little bit taller. I just really love that plant. And so there's a lot of alternatives there that you could use instead of turf grass that might fare a little bit better. So again, these are some of the more common diseases that we see primarily in landscape turf. I would say that I come across probably about 5 main things. So one of the first of these is going to be fairy ring, which we'll talk about briefly today. It's not really a disease in the same way that some of these others are. Typically, fairy ring shows up as a function of saprophytic fungi that are breaking down organic material in the soil. They're not necessarily parasitizing the turf, but we will see some symptoms of that activity that we may not like to see. And so that's something that we will see. I've been seeing it show up quite a bit here in my neighborhood in the fall this year, but we'll also see it pretty visible a lot of times in the spring as well. Gray leaf spot is one that we'll see quite a bit on St. Augustine grass lawns here in the summer months. For both gray leaf spot and fairy ring, we don't typically recommend a lot of chemical control for either of those in lawn type turf areas. A lot of times we recommend managing those more with cultural practices. Then we have large patch disease, which we'll talk about a lot today. We'll also kind of compare it to brown patch, which is a term you guys may be more familiar with. And if you go over here and you look at the causal agent, you'll see that the causal agent here is the same for both of these diseases. They're both Rhizoctonia solani, but they're different anastomosis groups. They have slightly different characteristics in terms of the hosts that we tend to see them on and where we typically see those symptoms most active on the plant, as well as the times of year. So a lot of times here in Texas, when we're talking about warm season grasses, we're primarily talking about large patch disease. And then finally, the other thing that we'll see quite a bit here in lawns here in Texas is going to be take-all root rot, take-all patch. This is caused by a pathogen called Monomyces graminis. We've talked about this some on Chat with Green Aggies before. This is something that I know Dr. Young-Hee Joe and Dr. Ong have both looked at quite a bit here in Texas. It is a pretty common issue, especially in St. Augustine grass lawns here. So we'll talk about those, all of those. And, I wanted to start off, I guess, talking a little bit about large patch in particular. This is the one that we think about a lot of times when we're going into the fall. We will very often see the symptoms of large patch disease most visible in the spring. However, this disease becomes active as our soil temperatures drop to around between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. In the fall. It'll kind of eat away at this turf grass, and then we just happen to notice it more in the spring because the rest of the turf around the disease area becomes greener, and it creates a lot of contrast there that makes it very visible. So again, this is caused by a pathogen called Rhizoctonia solani. This designation that you see here, this AG2-2LP, this refers to the anastomosis group for large patch compared to brown patch disease. Again, large patch is going to be most active in warm season turf. And here in Texas, we see it affect St. Augustine grass and zoysia grass most economically. It will show up in Bermuda grass and buffalo grass. A lot of times Bermuda grass can typically outgrow it fairly quickly. So we just don't think of it as being quite as much of a concern the way that we do with St. Augustine or zoysia grass, where those symptoms may linger and create a more lasting problem in our landscape. I will tell you that I've already been seeing quite a bit of large patch already this year. We had kind of an early drop in temperatures combined with some rainfall, and we started seeing symptoms, both myself and Crucy Seegers here in the Dallas area pretty quickly this year. And so we can expect that that's going to really show up and be an issue as we move into the spring. This particular disease, the patches tend to be pretty circular. So they have fairly rounded edges. They look pretty distinctly fungal. In the early spring, a lot of times we'll be able to see a gold or kind of orange ring around those patches where the disease is spreading outward in a radial pattern, and that you just see that color change in the turf there. These patches can be fairly small, or they can reach several feet in diameter, which is when people really become very alarmed by them. If we get up close to the plant, and these are some of the symptoms that we might be able to see now if we go out and we're starting to see something that looks kind of funky in our turf grass lawn areas. These disease shoots will pull easily from the sheath. This is a diagnostic tool, and we will typically see lesions on the sheaths kind of at the base of the plant, so near the crown. Now, brown patch disease, which tends to target cool season grasses, we will typically see more of the disease on the foliage, so the leaves of the plant, and it primarily, again, targets cool season grasses and tends to be more active in the summer, whereas large patch for us tends to be most active fall through spring. Now, historically, we associate large patch disease with a couple of primary environmental and management issues. The first is we often will see large patch coincide with areas that have been scalped or haven't been mowed appropriately, especially toward the end of the season. So that's going to be something important to consider. The other is that historically, there's been a connection made between large patch and excessive nitrogen. So a lot of times we recommend that as we get later in the season that we significantly scale back nitrogen, and I'm going to talk about some more specific recommendations here in a minute. But I did want to share for some of our professionals that there is a lot of new research on this particular topic, and it has kind of raised some new questions that I think we'll have to answer here in Texas, because unfortunately a lot of this work that's been done has been done up in the transition zone. This particular study here was done in Missouri and Kansas, where they wanted to look at more closely how nitrogen applications made during the transition seasons, spring and fall, affected large patch activity. And so what they did was they timed these fertilizer applications based on 5-day soil temperatures. This is a very similar method that we use when we are determining when to put out preventative fungicides or pre-emergence herbicides. Laura shared a tool in the chat that's a nice tool for some of this. It's the Greencast tool. And so what they did is they made an application of nitrogen in the fall when 2-inch soil temperatures reached around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's around the same time that we do a fall pre-emergence herbicide for winter annual weeds. And they also did 2 different treatments in the spring, one when soil temperatures reached around 60 and another when soil temperatures reached around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And what they ultimately found in this study is that these applications did not seem to have a significant impact on large patch activity at all. Conversely, we actually saw that, or they actually saw that there was greater green cover in some cases, prolonged fall color retention on these turf grasses, and a little bit earlier spring green up. And the increase in growth in the early spring actually appeared to reduce large patch severity in some cases. Might be able to make the argument that encouraging that growth kind of allowed the turf to grow out of that disease more quickly. We've seen some similar stuff when we're talking about take-all root rot. So this is kind of interesting because it does contradict a lot of what we have thought about nitrogen and large patch disease in the past. A very similar study that they published in 2019 with very similar results, very similar approach. They're using quick release nitrogen sources. Urea, ammonium sulfate are going to be two common sources we see used here in Texas. And again, found that there were not really any negative consequences to these late fall, early spring applications. And conversely, they actually saw some benefit to making these early season nitrogen applications. Now, a couple things I want to point out about this, and this is where I say we've got some questions we need to answer about this here in Texas, which is that first of all, these are very different climates than what we have here in Texas. Second of all, these studies were both conducted on zoysia grass at relatively low nitrogen rates. So if I go back to this study, they only applied about 1.5 pounds of nitrogen for the whole year, which is appropriate for zoysia grass, but it's very, very different from what we would see for a St. Augustine management program, where we may have anywhere between 1 and 4 pounds of nitrogen applied throughout the course of a growing season. So I think, these are some interesting studies. They shed light on the fact that there's still some things that we don't fully know or understand about the relationship between soil nutrients and disease activity. But I think that there's still a lot of work we need to do here in Texas as to how, whether or not these results can be applied to our management program here. In general, a few things to keep in mind. Nitrogen is going to offer the greatest impact to turf quality when it's applied when the turf is actively growing. Again, for us, that's typically going to be between around May and October. If we're applying too early in the season or too late in the season, typically we're going to run the risk that we're not going to get as much benefit and may in fact have some issues that we create for ourselves, whether it be an increase in weed activity, a possible increase in disease activity, and certainly what we will potentially see is waste. We do know from several studies now that making a final nitrogen application at the end of the season in the early fall can be beneficial in promoting fall color retention and promoting early spring greenup and health of turf the following spring. And there has been some work done here in Texas to that effect, where we've seen that making a final nitrogen application with a quick release product toward the end of the growing season and allowing that turf grass to take up and assimilate that nitrogen gives it a nice reserve, so that in the early part of spring, before that turf grass root system becomes more active again, it has something to pull on that can really sustain and support its health in the early parts of that season. So a lot of times what we will recommend is that a final nitrogen application should be made no later than 6 weeks before the historic first frost date for an area. We want to make sure that that turf grass has what it needs going into the winter, but there is some speculation that if we apply nitrogen too late in the season, it promotes too much vegetative growth. This can reduce cold hardiness and cause winter kill, winter injury. There's some other studies looking at that, newer studies looking at that are finding conflicting data. So, there's a lot that we have thought we knew about this that I think we're learning. There's still a little bit of work that needs to be done, but in general, what I can tell you is that we tend to over apply nitrogen in the landscape. Making a final application of around 0.5 pound to 1 pound of nitrogen about 6 weeks before the historic first frost date should generally be considered acceptable, but making nitrogen applications through the winter is not necessary and in fact could be harmful. At the very least, you're probably contributing to nutrient pollution of our water sources, and this has a lot of consequences. So once you've made that final fall application, you should suspend fertilizer applications until the following spring. We typically recommend that first nitrogen application goes out the next spring once you have mowed the turf, not the weeds, but the turf twice for the growing season to indicate that it's actively growing again. But as you can see, this is a ever-changing body of knowledge. And so as we continue to do more work on this, those recommendations may change over time. It's just part of science, right? Now, when it comes to large patch chemical control, typically fungicides are going to be most effective when they're applied preventatively. And a lot of times what I recommend to people is if you've got a zoysia grass or a St. Augustine grass lawn, and you have a history of dealing with this disease, then making a preventative application, fungicide application in the fall can be really helpful in protecting that lawn from additional damage. A lot of times we recommend that that first application go out around the same time as your fall pre-emergence herbicide. So once your soil temperatures drop to that 70-degree range for about 5 days, or ambient temperatures are between around 60 to 65 for 5 days, then you can make a preventative fungicide application. Depending on where you are in the state, it may be, and how severe this disease has been in the past, it may be appropriate to do sequential applications, particularly if you're a professional managing a high-value turf grass area. You'll just follow label recommendations in terms of sequential application. A lot of times the reapplication interval for large patch is going to be typically around 28 days or 4 weeks. So you'll just follow the label there. And a lot of times it'll specify that those sequential applications should be made within a certain soil temperature range. So if we get especially cold, it may be unnecessary. If we hover somewhere between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit soil temperature, then those may be conditions in which we make sequential applications. Now, you can also make an application in the spring. And in fact, if you look at some of the data from these transition zone research programs further north, they recommend about 4 applications for managing large patch throughout the year in professional turf, 2 in the fall and 2 in the spring. However, our pathologists here in Texas feel that spring applications are largely going to be far less effective compared to fall applications, just because we tend to warm up a lot more quickly. Very often, even though we're seeing symptoms in the spring, disease activity has already started to decline significantly. So while it may not necessarily be harmful, you may not see nearly the same benefit from spring applications that you would see from making preventative fall applications. Yes, so Marianne's asking about fungicides, so I'm gonna get to that here in just a second. Another thing that I do recommend, because turfgrass fungicides can be expensive, and if you're a professional watching, you know this is true. So if you're managing the same area year after year, you may notice that there's a trend as in the landscape where you see this disease more, maybe a low-lying area that stays wetter, maybe a shaded area. And sometimes we can map those areas and do precision applications where we reduce the fungicide footprint significantly. We kind of target the application in this more vulnerable area. And so if you are kind of strapped from a budget standpoint or concerned about that, that's one approach that you can take. Here's a list of active ingredients that we may see in fungicides that are labeled for controlling large patch disease. They'll vary quite a bit in terms of price. Most of them are going to be fairly effective that are on this list. So Azoxystrobin is going to be one of the more common active ingredients that we'll be able to find pretty easily. So if you're, master gardener, you're dealing with homeowners, this is an active ingredient that we would see on the ingredient list for some of our box store products. Another one would be propiconazole. Okay, you see here the two combined. Sometimes we may see tebuconazole as well. Some of these others may be more professional grade. They may not all be labeled for use in landscape areas. So again, you'll just want to refer to the label, ensure that that product is labeled for both the pathogen and the system and species of turf that you're managing, and follow label specifications in terms of rate and application timing to make sure that you don't apply fungicides in excess. I would say probably more often than any other pesticide, I see homeowners, members of the public over apply fungicide products. They see an issue with their turf because they can't immediately see any other cause. They reach for the nearest fungicide, assuming it's disease, and they may apply multiple fungicide products in a very short amount of time. And this can be problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, some of these fungicides can be damaging to turf grass, especially if we apply them in the summer during hot periods. Okay. Second of all, these products will affect soil microbial ecology. So they're going to affect the microbes that keep the soil healthy and active. Over applying them can be really problematic in the long term in terms of maintaining good biodiversity in the soil. And then finally, when we over apply fungicide products or any pesticide product, whether we're using the same fungicide over and over again, or we're using products at an inappropriate rate or in excess or whatever it is, and we're not following label recommendations, this can lead to disease resistance, which means that that pest becomes resistant to the products that we're trying to use to control it. And that's a problem. So we want to make sure that we're not just reaching for a product impulsively. We have, if we suspect that there's an issue, we take time to properly diagnose it, find a product that's labeled and appropriate, and we follow the recommendations for that product. And we incorporate that into an integrated pest management program where we consider our irrigation, fertilization, and cultivation practices and how we can modify those to reduce the disease pressure. I just wanted to, talk about a few other diseases as well. So here's fairy ring again. This is one that I get a lot of questions about during transition seasons. People are really familiar with type 3 fairy ring symptoms where they see the little mushrooms, right? That's what they associate with the name fairy ring. When we see some of these other symptoms, we may not always know what we're looking at. So I'll get a lot of questions about that. Fairy ring is going to be circular in shape, kind of similar to large patch, only you'll see here that it's a pretty distinctive ring as opposed to a patch. And we will see, again, 3 different types of symptomology. We'll see type 1, where you see this kind of dying out of the turf. Type 2, where we see a greener ring of turf compared to the turf around it. And then type 3, where we will see mushrooms or puffballs appear in a ring shape. Fairy ring, again, is not typically parasitizing this turf in the way some of these other diseases are. It's a whole bunch of fungi, typically multiple different species of fungi that are breaking down organic material in the system. And it's leading to these symptoms that we're seeing. So fairy ring can be introduced with the wind, and they can also be introduced with new sod, soil, or organic material. We may see fairy ring symptoms appear when we've got tree stumps or roots that are decomposing in the soil. So, when we look at kind of what causes some of these symptoms, so this first one here is the one I get a lot of questions about because it's the most distressing. We're seeing an area where turf is dying. This is caused by this organic activity that leads to a buildup of residues that basically make this area more water repellent. And so you can, basically what ends up happening is water cannot get to the turf grass roots because of that water repellent layer that's built up. And then this is what causes these this death or injury to occur. So for seeing this type of fairy ring, a lot of times what we would recommend is that we do some targeted irrigation with a hose to kind of break through that layer. And you can also use, if you're a professional, this is a good time for a wetting agent to increase the wettability of this area. If you do choose to use a fungicide, which we you may have limited results doing that just because of the diversity of fungi that we're dealing with. But if you do choose to use a fungicide, it needs to be combined with a wetting agent to really get that product where it needs to go to be effective. This type 2 fairy ring is caused by a flush of nitrogen released by that fungal activity that just ultra feeds this turf. So it just has some extra food to make it look especially healthy. A lot of times these symptoms can be masked by fertilizing the surrounding area, provided it's appropriate time to do so, to kind of green up everything around it. And then finally, this last one we typically see most commonly associated with woody debris. So tree stumps, tree roots, things like that. So We may, if this is a really bothersome thing, you may consider, if you know that there's something in there, removing that material in order to reduce this activity. And these symptoms can occur simultaneously as well. So with many of these diseases, again, we may see a correlation between activity and thatch buildup or accumulation of debris. So managing that will be helpful in kind of reducing activity of several of these diseases. Now, fall is not a good time to do this. Typically, we recommend that if you're going to do any kind of aggressive cultivation, whether it's verticutting or aeration, and this is a practice that we do when turf grass is actively growing and able to recover. So typically late spring, early summer is a good time. We don't want to do it this time of year because you know, you're physically injuring this area, and if we have a frost like we may have on Monday, you can have some pretty significant injury as a result of that. Top dressing, again, with high quality sand material can help break down thatch material as well. We kind of discussed all of this, kind of just steps to take for each of these. I'm going to kind of blow through this. There are some fungicides that are labeled for fairy ring. Again, we do not recommend chemical control for a home lawn situation. Typically, I recommend that you focus on some of these other cultural practices. If you're managing a professional system, sports field, golf course, something like that, you know, there are labeled products for dealing with that. A lot of times we recommend that you work with a pathologist to try to find the best product based on the specific composition of microbes that you have there, creating an issue. All right. Last big one that we'll talk about is going to be take all root rot, Gamenomyces graminis. So from a lawn and landscape turf perspective, I will most commonly see this in St. Augustine grass. However, I have seen it in every major warm season turf species now here in Texas. I've seen it in buffalo, centipede, zoysia, certainly Bermuda. It is a pretty common sight on Bermuda grass ultradwarf greens as well, although we'll typically refer to it as Bermuda decline instead of take all root rot, but same pathogen. This is a soil-borne disease. So this pathogen can exist in the soil, whether we're seeing symptoms or not. It's you know, Kevin Ong and I have talked about this. It's not the kind of thing that you can eradicate. It's just part of the normal soil ecology. We see a lot of diversity with this particular disease, a lot of diversity in the biotypes that are present. It's the way that they respond to different fungicides. And so, you know, a lot of times we will see that this pathogen can be very opportunistic. It takes advantage of conditions where our root growth is compromised. And so any steps we can take to encourage healthy root growth throughout the year can help in protecting our turfgrass areas from this disease. But if we happen to get a particularly strong biotype, then you know, we may still have issues with it. So typically for this one, what we will see is initially kind of this mottled yellowing in the turf, kind of looks like a tie-dye appearance, very similar to what iron deficiency looks like in turf. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the disease targets the roots and does affect nutrient uptake. So first symptoms we see resemble nutrient deficiency. As the disease progresses, we will see these irregular shaped patches similar to what you see here. They're not going to be as rounded as the large patch disease. They're going to be more irregular shaped. And we will also see pretty clear symptoms on the roots and the stolons of the plant. So the roots themselves will typically become brown, black, softer. They'll typically be underdeveloped. On the stolons, we'll commonly see that roots are not forming properly. We'll see discoloration on the nodes. Now, in the case of St. Augustine grass, there are a lot of things that can cause the stolons to not root down properly. So that by itself should not be your deciding factor that this disease is present. St. Augustine grass can be prone to what's called looping, where sometimes the stolons just like to hang out and float over the turf. There's not a super clear reason for it. And we may also see that occur as a function of pre-emergent herbicide use. So a lot of different things can cause that. So we need to consider the whole picture. Now, the hyphae and the hypopodia of this particular disease are visible pretty readily with some magnification. So Skip, do you want to talk about, I guess, kind of your approach? I know that you use your cell phone a lot of times to diagnose this.
Yeah, it's big enough, I guess, for a fungus that you can actually see it with. I use a hand loop, the little jeweler's loop. Trying to drag one out of my pocket right now. You caught me off guard, Becky.
Sorry.
These little jeweler's loops, like you see, you can buy gadgets that attach to your phone, but just putting one of those on the back of your cell phone makes an amazingly large. In fact, doing that and then pinching out on the cell phone gets you about a 60 power microscope, which is enough to see Gymnotomyces pretty well on the runners.
Mm-hmm.
But if you start looking, you see it everywhere. It's pretty ubiquitous, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is one of those that it's there very often, and so we have to kind of weigh that, take that into consideration when we're thinking about how to manage it. But again, because this can be so opportunistic, taking some really simple steps to modify your cultural practices and improve root health can go a long way toward preventing this from becoming more severe. We do see that this disease it does seem to prefer alkaline soil conditions, and we have a lot of alkaline soils here in Texas. I've also seen this disease more active following certain herbicide applications. And what I would just say, and I'll start by saying that there's not a research study on this, so take it with a grain of salt. But if this disease is present and you know that this has been an issue for you, my recommendation is that you, at least until the situation has resolved and turfgrass health has improved, that you do not make any broadcast herbicide applications. In particular, many of our pre-emergent herbicides that we apply in the spring are root inhibiting. And so if this disease is present and our turf is effective, putting out a product that inhibits the turf's ability to create healthy roots, I think it could significantly exacerbate this disease. And I think even any of our weed scientists would say herbicides are designed to be used in healthy turf systems. So anytime something is compromising the health of that system, that's a time that we really want to be judicious and scale back those applications. I'm a big fan of pre-emergent herbicides when appropriate. I think that they can be really helpful. But if this disease is a recurring issue, maybe try scaling back on that, focusing more on cultural mechanical control of weeds. You can do some spot treating with a post-emergent herbicide, but avoiding products that may affect root health, I think, could be beneficial. Other things we want to do, again, in the early spring, take steps to alleviate soil compaction, balance your soil fertility practices. We're big proponents here at AgriLife of soil testing, making informed decisions about the fertilizer products that we use, not overdoing it. Maintaining appropriate mowing heights that encourage deep root growth, and irrigating appropriately. Deep and infrequent irrigation encourages deeper root growth. If we water too frequently, too shallowly, typically our roots are going to reflect that by not growing nearly as deeply.
Becky, can I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
You've made several comments talking about people applying their own fungicides and things. When you turn homeowners loose with herbicides, bad things happen. And we've gotten a lot of samples this fall at the Extension office of grass that just doesn't have a chance. It's got take all root rot on the old part of the runner. The new part of the runner, all the roots are clubbed from overuse of DNA herbicides like pendimethalin and others. And it's like, where is it going to get water? There's no way to get water in the plant. And I see that too often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we will see a lot of times the symptoms of this disease show up really early in the season. And I know Dr. Ong has speculated that has a lot to do with the fact that the turf is caught in a period where its roots cannot grow fast enough to outgrow the disease. And again, as Skip indicated, sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot over applying some of these products that further contribute to that. So doing everything with a balanced approach, being careful not to over apply, some of these products and not to apply them to turf grass systems that are already compromised. It's very, very important in maintaining a healthy area. So a lot of times for this particular disease, if we know we have a known history of it, making preventative fungicide applications in spring and fall can be helpful. But in my conversations with many county agents and professionals throughout the state, very often fungicides alone are just not sufficient for combating this disease. They have to be part of a larger, more comprehensive program that's focused on encouraging healthy root growth, focused on producing soil conditions that are going to be less favorable to the disease. We have seen some positive impact of some peat moss top dressing when this disease is present in combination with a core aeration. The thinking behind the peat moss, there's few different papers on this, and there's kind of two different big schools of thought. The first is that the peat moss can at least temporarily affect the pH right at that critical physical space where the disease is most active. If the disease prefers more alkaline or higher pH conditions, little peat moss may help drop that pH and help the turf overcome. The other thought is that introducing organic material of any kind will change the carbon to nitrogen ratios and the microbial composition of that soil. And so it may create an environment where there are more microbes to compete with the Gamenomyces, kind of knocks it off its throne a little bit. So this is a pretty challenging pathogen to study, is my understanding from some of our pathologists. It's just difficult to contain, control, and inoculate. Compared to some other pathogens. So this limits our ability sometimes to do more applied research, but we do have some work on this pathogen that's being done. And so, as we continue to have more findings, we will continue to share those. But in general, what I would say is do everything you can not to overdo it. Don't over apply pesticides of any kind. And be judicious in how much water, fertilizer, et cetera, you're putting out into your system. To really find that balanced approach. So Skip is saying, one study I found indicated chelated iron source to the peat application helped even more. And we do see, again, that there's some nutrient deficiency that occurs here. It's kind of a never-ending cycle. Roots are compromised, nutrient uptake is inhibited. The iron itself, we tend to see deficient already in alkaline soils. And so this is another factor that can put our turf at a disadvantage. If that soil is very alkaline and the plant is already deficient in iron, then it's weakened already. So chelated iron, or a foliar application, liquid foliar application of iron can be beneficial in kind of offsetting that potential deficiency and bolstering the resilience of the turf overall. So here's some of the labeled fungicides that we may see for take all root rot, Gamenomyces. Again, just comes down to reading, following the label, ensuring that both the pathogen and the species of turf you're managing are on that label, and following recommendations about when and how much to apply. If you ever want to get help identifying disease, of course, you can always start off with your AgriLife County Extension agent. You'll want to share as much information as possible. Too often, we get at AgriLife a picture of a blurry patch of turf from 10, 20 yards away, and a question of what's causing this. And the more information we have and the more diversity in photos that we have, the easier it is for us to help you. Dr. Ong does run a lab that will accept turf grass samples and analyze them. In order to do this, you'll have to take a sample from the outer edge of the affected patch, 4 to 6 inch diameter sample, typically, roots and all. This is where the disease is most active. That's why we want it to be taken there. If we sample right here from the inside, the disease just may not be nearly as active. And so we may not get as much out of that. So once you take that sample, you can put it in a 1 gallon Ziploc bag. If you can't get it right out, refrigerate it. Try to minimize Yes, that's right. He does diagnoses, not autopsies. Send him living material. And you can ship that to our disease diagnostic lab. They'll look at it for you and provide a report. We do have a lot of lookalikes when it comes to disease. During warmer months, we get a lot of irrigation issues, soil compaction issues, water-related issues that lead to patches in the turf that may resemble disease but are not in fact disease. And we also have certain insects that can also cause activity that can resemble disease, including grubs and chinch bugs. And so again, just taking time to properly diagnose the issue. It's all about balance. It's really kind of the summary of this today. So I think I've answered most of the questions that have come up. Laura, anything that I missed?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I think we did have a little chatty discussion about eating the mushrooms in your fairy ring, and that's not a good idea. So yeah, to the best of my knowledge, none of those are, I mean, they may not kill you, but they're not good. So yeah.
You don't want to throw them into a stir fry.
Nah, just go to the store, pick up
some good shiitakes.
Yeah, they'll be much better. Much better. Yeah. So anyway.
Well, we're kind of right at time.
Yeah.
I talked a lot, so I'm sorry, but we had limited topics today, so I just decided to fill the void.
No, you did. And we agents get so many questions about turf, and I guess one thing I wanted to point out is that the weather has such a big impact on when all these things happen, and when you can fertilize and when you should apply your fungicide and all of those things. So everybody wants a date, and it's hard because
I tell people, unfortunately, these weeds and diseases, they're not sitting in the soil with a little calendar waiting to pop up, and unfortunately here in Texas, we have the added pleasure of our weather being totally erratic, especially during these transition seasons. So it's very challenging, from an input standpoint, water, nutrients, all of those things. A lot of times, if you just focus on putting those things out when you're having to mow every week or 2 weeks, and that turf is actively growing, you're generally going to be pretty safe. Once we get to a point that turf grass growth is significantly slowing down, you look at, we say, I don't have to mow this much. Those are not periods where we need to be putting in a lot of inputs. Typically.
That's a really good way to think about it. Yeah.
So,
really.
All right. Well, this was fun. Skip, anything else you want to add from your more Southern perspective?
No, I think you've covered it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us today. I'm glad you could hang out with us. And as usual, I need to share the survey link.
Oh, yes, please do. And we do appreciate you all who take the time to fill out our survey. It really is important to us as we try to get the information out there that you need and make sure that we're doing things that are actually helpful. So it's really, really
it takes like 2 minutes, maybe not even, depending on how much input you have to fill that out real quick. So yeah, if you'll just click that link that's there in the chat, it really helps us out. And I think that's all I've got. As usual, if you guys have any follow-up questions, you can email any of us here at Talk with Green Ideas to follow up with you and try to make sure your question gets answered. We appreciate you joining us, and we will be back next week for, I think, a Halloween themed.
I've heard. Yeah.
So we look forward to seeing all of you guys then.
Thanks, everybody.